So last April, Fallon from So Be It Quilts and I got together and we decided to do a collaboration where we both made the exact same pattern, which was a table runner. I have mine here. We used the exact same fabric line, but we switched the colorways. So I used this is all wrinkled up here. I used a dark background as the background and she used the light as the background. And it was just such a fun project to do together and to give you all a variety of different ways that you can use a layer cake. This year we decided to do the same thing this April, but we of course changed up the parameters of the project. We both decided on this Anne of Green Gables fabric by Riley Blake Designs. We both love Anne of Green Gables, so it was an easy choice. Here's the back, you can see all the fabrics. We also decided to try out these cake mixes. Now I've never used them before. I don't think Fallon has either. And I chose cake mix number 5. There's at least 10 of these, probably more, and they're basically sheets of paper that you sew onto. I also cut 10-inch squares, 40 of these, for background because I wanted to have the background consistent. But before I get started showing you exactly how I use these and what I'm going to do when I'm picking my fabric and all of that wonderful stuff, my name is Chris O'Neill from Sew the Distance. Thank you so much for joining me. So let's get started playing with these cake mixes and the fabric and picking our fabrics from the line, all that wonderful stuff, and have some fun. So in this pack of fabric, there were 21 prints and 2 of each print. So I went ahead and pulled out all of the light fabrics you can see here and set them aside because I'm not going to be using them in this project. It's not enough of a contrast with my background fabric. It will just not sparkle like I want it to. So I'm going to stick with the mediums and dark fabrics. And the way I determine this is by taking a black and white photo of the fabrics. I actually used the back of the card that had all the pictures of the fabrics. So then I just took a picture with my phone and changed it in editing settings to black and white. And that allowed me to pull out all of the very light fabrics. The one that I did leave in is this one. It's a medium, but a really light medium, so we'll see how that works out. I'm not so sure how it will work out, but we'll see. To make these blocks, we're gonna take our cake mix. I took one sheet out, and I'm gonna make one block. Once I see how it's all put together, I will make the rest of them. So let me move these out of the way. And I always do that. I like to make a test block. If you've been watching me for a while, you know that that's kind of my thing. It allows me to see how it's put together and also address any mistakes without wasting a ton of fabric. So what I did was took one of the prints, and I'm using this green. And actually, that doesn't show up too well on camera. I'm going to swap that out for purple. Here, that's going to show up a little bit better. So this purple, and I'm going to put right sides together with my background and layer it, and then take this paper and place it on top. Now on this paper there are instructions on how to sew. It says to start where the star is and to follow the arrows. So you can see it tells me to go all the way up here, around, around, and back. And then there's another section which is our 4 patches, and it tells me to go this way. So I'm going to sew them all before I cut them apart. I'm going to use a shorter stitch length than I normally would. That's going to allow me to get the papers off a little bit easier. And this paper is like thin. It's not tissue paper, but it's also not like copy paper weight. It's kind of somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this and meet you back here. All right, so this is done. I didn't do a great job. I'm learning, and this is why we do a test block, and I just wanted to show you some of the mistakes I made. I didn't sew directly on the line. I had the wrong foot on my machine, so I had to go back and do it again. And I can't tell you how important it is. This is a great example of why you do a test block. The other thing I'm going to probably do is pin this because it did shift. And yeah, this is quite messy. You can see on the back it's very messy because I had to make several different stitches, which is, of course, is not the way this was intended to be put together. I am going to cut it apart, continue making this test block and seeing what else I can learn. So I have a rotary cutter that I use specifically for paper. It just has an old blade in it. That's what I do. So I am going to use that. I don't want to use my good rotary cutter because I don't want to dull the blade. The next step in this process is to cut on these lines. All right, I'm going to cut right on that line. Even that I'm off a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and cut the rest of these lines. All right, so now I have these units, and I'm going to press them. And you can see I have half of a 4-patch unit here, and another half here, like that. The directions say to put these together, and so a 1/4 inch seam to make your 4-patch. So I have a bunch of those, and then I also have half square triangles. All right, so these are great. These are all sewn together now, and they're right on. I mean, everything lined up, which is nice, and that's definitely an advantage to these papers. I'm gonna clip everything together that goes with the same fabrics. So I have it all. I'm going to keep making blocks. Okay, so I have all my papers here, and they're all sandwiched, ready to go. I have my sewing machine set up. I put my walking foot on because there are 3 layers, and I want to make sure that I can get through all 3 and they stay together. I also pinned them. I don't know, I might change my mind about the pins. I'll let you know afterward on how I feel about it. I don't want it to lift up any of the fabric or even the template, so we'll see how that goes. I shortened my stitch length. I also put in a new needle. Now you don't have to do that because this paper is going to dull the needle, but I wanted it to be nice and crisp to, I don't know. I just feel better putting in a new needle at the beginning of a project. So I'm going to sew these and I'm going to use the instructions. Now each one of these cake mixes has different instructions, of course, because it's different configurations. So make sure you pay attention to them. You could also highlight some of the important stuff like the star, where to start, where to cut first, all of that. That's a good idea, but I wouldn't do it after you put it onto the fabrics because that highlighter might bleed through, but it would help you for sure. So I'm going to start sewing these. I will time it and see how long it takes me to get through these. I'm told that it is monotonous from Fallon because she did her video before mine. She recorded it before mine. I think we're posting it at the same time. So I will get started sewing. Okay, so I'm going to interrupt the tutorial just for a moment, tell you something that happened. So I was sewing the papers, the sets together, just like you saw in the last clip. I was getting bored. So I decided I was going to do maybe 10 of them and then cut them apart, sew them together, get the blocks done, and then do the next set of 10. First, I want to say I improved greatly on sewing on that line. I was dead on that line. I had the right foot on. I was doing great with that. However, when I went to put the actual blocks together, the block was supposed to be 7.5 inches by 7.5 inches unfinished, okay, before it was put into a quilt. It was not. It was shy of about 1/4 of an inch, if not a little more. I should have, in the beginning, instead of just making the pieces for the block, I should have put the entire block together. This would have saved me a lot of time, a lot of energy, and frankly, a lot of the product that I wasted making bad blocks. And I ended up having, I don't know, what is it? There are 2 blocks per page, so 20 blocks. I have them here, pieces, my duds, that did not measure up to the right size. So to fix this, I went back to the sheet. I extended how far I sewed these lines here. Also cut out these squares bigger. And then I squared them up using the lock block ruler. Okay, so I got them to the 4 inch by 4 inch that they were supposed to be. Down here for the 4 patches, I actually measured out the increments instead of depending right on the lines and cutting on the lines. So that's how I fixed the problem. And I think it's important to tell you this because, maybe I got a bad batch. When I do measure it out, it does measure a little short. So that could just be a bad printing of these. It is also important to tell you this because if you're a new sewist, you might think of this as a really easy project. If you don't really know enough about quilting and how these blocks go together, you might get really frustrated that things aren't coming out. Maybe it was me. I don't think so, just because, come on, you're just sewing on a line. I've been sewing for over 25 years. I can sew on a line. Of course, my first segment showed that I couldn't really sew on a line, but whatever. But I can sew on a line and I did get better at sewing on the line. But there are fixes for it. I just wish I would have realized the issue sooner. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how I cut the pieces out with the adjustments and how I used the lock block ruler and measured out everything. So the first thing I did was I cut around the sections. So you can see here there are 3 sections in this particular pattern. I just cut around them. It does say to cut this line first, but I don't cut on that line, and I'll show you why in a moment. So I just cut between these two. These are my 4-patch units here. So I'm just going to set those aside for a minute. And then these are my half square triangles. And I just cut them apart around the area. Now I have 3 units. I want to show you how I'm going to do these half square triangle units. I decided to just make them a smidge bigger and then use my lock block ruler to square them up. So I cut them. Oh, I should say, I also pressed the paper and the units and everything as I was making them. So they got pressed so everything was set. And that really, I think, helped with the whole process. So I'm just going to go a smidge bigger. Not much, and it doesn't necessarily have to be straight because I'm going to square them up. Okay, and like I said, I sewed a little beyond the line, which helped too. And then the center piece, I cut. Now to stabilize that bias, I pushed this back gently, and then I pressed this really well while the paper was still on. Okay, so these two are pressed, as you can see, and the paper is still on them. At this point, I remove the paper. Now, I know the instructions for this says to wait. For me, it just made more sense removing it now. So to remove the paper, I just fold this back on itself, and then this should just tear away. We had nice small stitches, so it just pulls away nice and easily, or it should. Of course, this one's gonna give me trouble because I'm recording. And then I just pull this off. There's a little bit in there. You can take some tweezers or it'll just come off in the wash. It's just paper. All right, and then I'll do this one. Fold it back, tear. Trying not to be too rough with that bias edge. Okay, pull that off. Okay, so then I took my rotating mat, just so you can see it, my lock block ruler. I know this needs to be 4 inches. And you can see I got lots and lots of room around this to trim it up and get it to the right size. So I'm going to take my little rotary cutter, cut around it, all that stuff away, a little nubby there that doesn't want to come off. And I'm just going to take this to the 4-inch, rotate my mat, and cut these. And now I have the right size and it's going to be less frustrating. And I'm going to do that to all of them. It's an extra step and it's not something I'm sure the pattern intended, but for whatever reason, these were not coming out no matter how straight that I line them up. I'm going to set that aside and I'm going to show you how to cut these out. Now these are a little bit different because you really can't over sew or make them bigger. And actually these weren't coming out too bad for me, so I wasn't as concerned, but I did measure as I cut because I was nervous. So I am going to cut the edges first here. And I cut a little beyond the line, not much. Again, I'm very disappointed that this happened. It really is a frustrating part of it. You really expect everything to be perfect. Okay, so there's those. And then, so I'm going to cut in here, and I actually measure, and that helped a lot with the squareness of my blocks. Okay, so now I have these units, and this right here is your seam allowance. So I mean, you don't have to be perfect with this. You can go in with a rotary cutter or scissors. That's really not going to make that much of a difference if you're a little off on those lines. All right, so now I have these units, and these are the ones that are going to be made into my 4 patches. So at this point, I'd already set the seams before when it was on the full paper. So I just go through and pull out the papers, because there's no bias edge. Everything was straight, so I don't have to really worry about that. So I did this. I'll just do it to 2 to show you. And then I pressed to the dark side, And I just finger pressed first, and then I took it to the iron. And then when I put them together, I'm going to sew them like this, and these seams are going to nest nicely like that, so they fit into one another. Then you just sew down one of the sides and you get a 4-patch that looks like one of these. After that, we're going to put the block together. I'm going to show you how we do that. Okay, so like I said before, each of these sheets here that are in the cake mixes will make 2 blocks. Each block has 2 half-square triangles and 2 4-patches. So I have them here, and I'm going to show you the different configurations that they suggest, although you can play with this and get all kinds. So there's this one that looks like this. Okay, so that's one way that you could lay these blocks out. You can also turn it just this way and have this, or turn these and have this. And you really can play with these a lot. If you want to, you can take all of the 4-patches, I'm sorry, the half-square triangles rather, and you can make a pinwheel, or you can take the 4-patches and put them together like that. And you know, all of the suggestions are here right on the cake mix, so you can play with it and do all kinds of things. My configuration, what I liked the best was this one here. I really like the layout of this. I think it's going to look really pretty. Now I could even make it scrappy and pull in different pieces, but I decided to keep all the fabrics in the same block. So the next step is to sew this to this and this to this, and then once those are sewn together, you're going to sew this unit to this unit, just like that. And you'll have a finished block. Let me show you one. So right here is one of the finished blocks. Okay. What's really cool about this pattern and why I chose it is because when you put more than one of these together, you get some really cool secondary patterns. And you can see that here. And then you can even turn these and get a totally different look, or you can make them all go the same direction and get something like this. And you can really have some fun with this and do different layouts. The layout I decided on is this layout, and I think it's called the jewel box. I'm not positive about that, but I love the way this looked. I love the way this came together, and I like the secondary pattern. It just, to me, was a really pretty layout, especially for these colors. I did lay out all of the blocks the way I wanted them, and then I played with the colors. I wanted to make sure the mediums were well distributed, and to do that, of course, I did my trick where I took a picture on my camera and made it black and white so I could see where the values were. And this really did help, as it always does, to make it just a little bit more pleasing to the eye. After I decided on the layout, I decided to stitch these into 4s. So you can see there's a set of 4 blocks. I'll put that right in here. And this just allowed me to get the points a little bit more on, because even though I made the blocks a little bit bigger, some of the 4-patches still weren't exactly right, and I just wanted to make sure that I could have some control over that. So the next thing I did was sew the rows together. I've sewed this one together, and this would actually make a really pretty table runner if you just wanted to do this. So this is all together here. Hopefully that doesn't fall. And I'm going to sew the next 4 rows together, and then I'll sew the rows together. So row 1, 2, 3, and 4. So the next step, finish sewing all of these and then have a finished quilt top. After I finished sewing the top together, I sandwiched it, quilted it, and bound it. And now for the big reveal. It's finished. It's so pretty. It's soft and cuddly. I haven't washed it yet, but I intend to. Now, is it perfect? No. And I have a video coming up, hopefully within the next week or two, about what exactly went wrong, a little bit more detail, even with quilting it and everything. I don't know if that's ever happened to you where you have a project and everything seems to go wrong. That's kind of what happened with this project. But it is beautiful and it did turn out really nice. I chose this really busy backing fabric. I got this at a yard sale. I think I got like 8 yards of it. So I had a ton of it and I think I paid like $4 or something like that. So it was the perfect thing to put on the back and it matched because of all the purples, of course. As for the binding, I chose to just take some scraps of greens that I had and put them together, so it's a very scrappy binding. I think it also added a little bit of sparkle to it. I really like the way it turned out with the scrappy binding. All these happy accidents kind of came together at the end, and that's usually what happens with quilting. A few things I just want to mention for tips on this. I mentioned in the video that I use pins. I actually switched to clips. Clipping those papers on top of the background and the focus fabric made it a little bit more easy to adjust as I was sewing through. It also didn't put any bubbles into the fabrics. So that's one tip I would recommend. As far as the walking foot, it wasn't necessary. I sewed some without the walking foot. It worked beautifully too. And the last thing is I did pull out the blocks that were made with that light medium that I talked about early on. It just didn't add anything to the quilt. Your eye kind of caught those blocks. I didn't like the way it looked. I'd like to give a big thank you to Fallon from So Be It Quilts for doing this with me. I love this. I love working with her. I'm so glad I met her and I'm so glad that we got to work on this together in a way, even though she's in Texas and I'm here in Pennsylvania. I hope you have a wonderful day. Make sure you take some time to sew and I'll see you soon. Bye.